Today, we're breaking down the moment 100 Sherpas turned on one Karen during an Everest summit push. At 28,000 feet, she tried to use her wealth as leverage against the mountain's gatekeepers, only to learn that money carries no authority in the death zone. The crisis wasn't weather or gear, it was ego. By the time the line stalled below the summit, her fate was already sealed. It was May 23, 2017, at 11:42 a.m. High on Everest's southeast ridge, climbers were stalled at roughly 28,700 feet, about 350 vertical feet below the summit. Sustained winds moved across the ridge at around 18 miles per hour, gusting to 25, while temperatures held near negative 16 degrees Fahrenheit. At that elevation, the air carried only about one-third of the oxygen available at sea level, making supplemental oxygen essential for clear thinking and controlled movement. Along the narrow route, a single-file line of more than 200 climbers stretched nearly 400 feet down the fixed rope towards the south summit, all clipped to a 10-millimeter line anchored every 30 to 50 feet, where passing was unsafe and descending traffic had priority. Rose Mitchell, 52, stood 17th in line with approximately 5 hours of oxygen, remaining at 2.2 liters per minute. Even while standing still, her breathing was already slightly elevated inside the mask. Her guide, Pemba Sherpa, 34, had recalculated the turnaround margin based on her pace from Camp 4, and the buffer was narrowing. The fixed rope was intact, anchors were secure, and weather conditions remained within summit limits. Rose, a pharmaceutical executive from Greenwich, Connecticut, had previously completed guided climbs of Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, and Denali. She had no technical ice background and no experience above Denali's 20,310 feet before Everest, where she paid $85,000 for a fully supported one-to-one guided package with elite Himalayan expedition. Pemba had summited Everest 12 times over 9 seasons and was known for consistent descents under pressure. In the 3 weeks before the summit push, Rose logged repeated complaints at base camp regarding food, pacing, and rope priority. On May 9th, she accused a Sherpa assistant of stealing a battery pack, later found in her own duffel. On May 12th, she publicly criticized Pemba's pacing during a rotation to Camp 2. Additional disputes over rope position occurred on May 14th and May 18th. None violated expedition rules, but all were observed and recorded. Information at base camp spreads informally through shared mess tents, radio coordination, and daily briefings where guides assess client behavior and risk. By summit week, most Sherpa teams on the South Col route knew her name based on repeated impatience and resistance to direction. The commercial route depends on mutual reliance. Companies share fixed ropes, weather data, and emergency coordination, and Sherpas assist across teams when needed. Above 26,000 feet, there is no independent rescue system, and survival often depends on nearby Sherpas choosing to help. That season's fixed rope system, installed in early April, ran from Camp 4 at 26,000 feet to the 29,332-foot summit, anchored with ice screws, snow pickets, and rock protection. Climbers remained clipped in throughout ascent and descent, moving sequentially along a single line. During congestion, they waited attached to the rope, consuming oxygen without gaining ground. Turnaround times were calculated from oxygen supply, weather forecasts, and guide assessment, with descent required no later than 2 p.m. to account for slower movement and cognitive decline at extreme altitude. Decisions above the South Col were often made in real time, with limited communication and no external rescue infrastructure. On May 23rd, conditions were stable. The jet stream had shifted north, winds were manageable, and multiple teams committed to summit pushes. Rose and Pemba left Camp 4 at 9:15 p.m. on May 22nd with a clear plan. Reach the balcony by 3 a.m., the south summit by 8 a.m., stand on the summit by early afternoon, and begin descending no later than 2 p.m. But by 11:42 a.m., they were still 350 vertical feet below the summit, stalled in a slow-moving queue. At that altitude, small delays don't stay small for long. Rose's oxygen flow had climbed from 2.2 to 2.8 liters per minute, cutting her remaining supply to just over 4 hours. Without warning, she unclipped from the fixed rope and stepped onto a 45-degree slope of hard ice to bypass 2 climbers. Pemba reached her within seconds and clipped her back in. No one was injured, but several Sherpas witnessed the deviations, and a brief radio call confirmed her off-route movement. On Everest, small deviations rarely stay isolated. The line crept forward again, but anchor transitions ahead were slowed by cold, stiffened hands. Each pause burned oxygen without gaining ground. At 12:14 p.m., descending traffic forced another stop. Rose stood motionless for 4 minutes, still breathing at the elevated flow rate. Pemba advised her to regulate her breathing and reminded her that the turnaround margin was shrinking. They reached the Hillary step at 12:31 p.m. Rose hesitated during the anchor transfer, but completed it with assistance. Above the step, the slope eased and the queue thinned. They stepped onto the summit at 12:58 p.m. On top, Rose removed her pack and attempted a satellite call. The first 2 attempts failed. The third connected. She stayed on the phone for 6 minutes, then asked for additional photos. Her total summit time reached 19 minutes. During that window, winds increased to a steady 22 miles per hour with higher gusts, and cloud bands began building from the southwest. None of it was immediately dangerous, but the margin was narrowing. They began their descent at 1:17 p.m., already past the planned buffer. This was the second structural crack. Delayed descents compress safety margins. From the summit to Camp 4 was roughly 3,000 vertical feet, typically a 4 to 5 hour descent under normal conditions. At 1:17 p.m., Rose had 2 hours and 51 minutes of oxygen remaining at her current flow rate. Camp 4 was still at least 4 hours away. The math was clear. Pemba reduced her flow to 2.0 liters per minute to extend the supply. The trade-off was unavoidable. Lower flow preserved oxygen, but reduced cognitive sharpness and physical output. From that point forward, the margin would only move in one direction. Rose did not notice the adjustment. Changes in flow rate are not immediately perceptible to climbers, unfamiliar with their own physiological response. She continued down the ridge, clipping and unclipping at each anchor, her movements slower than during the ascent. Descending placed more load on the quadriceps and knees, and crampon placement had to remain precise to avoid front point slips. Fatigue built quickly despite the lower cardiovascular demand. At 1:42 p.m., just below the south summit at approximately 28,700 feet, Rose sat down without warning. Sitting during descent is common among exhausted climbers, but it becomes dangerous when unplanned. Core temperature drops, muscles stiffen, and psychological inertia sets in. The longer a climber rests, the harder it becomes to move again. Pemba instructed her to limit the stop to 5 minutes. She argued she needed longer. He warned that extended sitting increased the risk of frostbite and hypothermia. She insisted she knew her own body. As her agitation increased, her breathing grew faster and more forceful. Oxygen consumption rose sharply despite the reduced regulator setting, effectively driving her usage back toward higher output. At that pace, her remaining supply fell from 2 hours and 29 minutes to 1 hour and 54 minutes. Pemba chose not to tell her. More agitation would likely drive her consumption even higher. After 4 minutes, he helped her to her feet. She complied, but slowly. Her legs trembled, a sign of deep muscular fatigue and possible early altitude-related weakness. They resumed descent at 1:46 p.m. The route from the south summit to Camp 4 followed the exposed southeast ridge, a narrow snow arete, dropping steeply on both sides. Fixed ropes marked the path, but wind exposure had increased. Gusts now reached 35 miles per hour, forcing climbers to brace between steps. Rose's balance wavered twice. Pemba stayed within arm's reach, ready to arrest a fall. She remained upright, but her movements were losing precision. At 2:18 p.m., they reached the balcony at 27,500 feet. Rose asked to stop again. Pemba refused, reminding her they were already behind schedule and needed continuous movement. She sat anyway. This time he did not argue. He stood beside her, shielding her from the wind, and after 3 minutes, insisted they continue. She rose without protest, but her pace had deteriorated further. Each clip transition took longer. Her hands fumbled repeatedly with the carabiners. Cold and hypoxia were eroding her fine motor control. Pemba had seen this pattern before, and it rarely reversed above the South Col. They reached Camp 4 at 3:18 p.m. Camp 4, known as the South Col, sits at roughly 26,000 feet on a barren saddle between Everest and Lhotse. That season, about 40 tents were spread across a wind-scoured mix of rock and hard ice, along with scattered gear left from earlier expeditions. Sustained winds often pushed past 40 miles per hour, creating a steady low roar that made normal conversation difficult even at close range. Rose and Pemba entered their small two-person dome tent, which was secured with ice screws and weighted with rocks against the gusts. Inside the tent, Rose immediately took out her satellite phone and contacted the base camp coordinator. Pemba could hear parts of the conversation through the thin tent wall and the wind outside. Rose filed a formal complaint, saying the pacing had been unsafe, the support inadequate, and the guide dismissive. She asked for a replacement guide for the descent from Camp 4 to base camp. The request was logged at 3:31 p.m. Following normal expedition procedure, the base camp coordinator began calling nearby teams by radio to see if a Sherpa escort was available. The message was direct. A client at the South Col needed guided descent the following morning, and compensation was negotiable. 6 companies were contacted one after another. Several reported no availability, explaining that their Sherpas were already committed to summit rotations, load carries, or managing their own descending clients. Others declined briefly, citing weather exposure or existing priorities. Most teams were already focused on moving their own climbers down during the narrow weather window, leaving little flexibility for additional assignments at the South Col. Operationally, many of the refusals were reasonable. Multiple expeditions were still managing summit traffic and return schedules with limited staffing at extreme altitude. Radio records later showed that some teams did have personnel not actively moving on summit day, but internal discussions took place before final responses were given. The decisions appeared consistent with normal risk management at that elevation. In the weeks leading up to the summit push, Rose had drawn attention at base camp and the upper camps. Her disputes over rope priority, public arguments with Pemba, formal complaints, and the earlier moment when she briefly unclipped from the fixed line near 28,700 feet had all been noted by high-altitude staff. Among Sherpa teams, information often spreads through daily coordination and shared camp routines. Guides routinely assess which clients follow direction closely and which require closer management. At 26,000 feet and above, taking responsibility for an unsupported climber means committing to additional time in the death zone, where exposure increases risk for everyone involved. During the radio exchanges, no one mentioned reputation directly. The responses remained calm and procedural. However, the outcome was straightforward. 6 teams were contacted, and none accepted the additional assignment. From that point on, Rose did not have a confirmed support plan for the descent. At 4:05 p.m., Pemba invoked the withdrawal clause in his guiding contract. Such clauses are standard on Everest and allow a guide to end service if a client's actions create unacceptable risk or violate agreed protocols. His decision was documented and transmitted to base camp. Before leaving, he gave Rose clear instructions for the descent. Depart Camp 4 at first light around 5:30 a.m. Remain clipped at every anchor. Avoid stopping above the blue ice band near 24,500 feet. And maintain an oxygen flow of no less than 3.0 liters per minute. Under normal movement, the descent to Camp 3 was expected to take about 4 hours, and the full descent to Camp 2 about 8. Pemba and his assistant left Camp 4 at 4:22 p.m., descending with their personal gear and load equipment. Rose remained alone in the tent. She did not begin her descent at first light the next morning. At 5:47 a.m. on May 24th, Rose was still inside her tent at Camp 4. She had heard the instructions. She had 2 full oxygen cylinders, each capable of delivering roughly 6 hours at 3.0 liters per minute. Weather conditions remained stable, and the fixed ropes on the route were intact. A descent was physically possible. Instead, she waited. Between 6 a.m. and 7:30 a.m., she sent 3 satellite messages to base camp, asking for updates on a replacement escort. Each reply was consistent. No Sherpa escorts were available, and she was advised to begin a solo descent following the instructions already provided. She did not leave. At 8:15 a.m., she sent a 4th message stating she would not descend without a guide, citing safety concerns and her understanding of the contract. Base camp replied that the withdrawal clause had been properly invoked and that a replacement guide was not guaranteed under those terms. They again advised her to begin descending. She remained at Camp 4. Time at 26,000 feet steadily increases physical strain. At that altitude, the body cannot fully recover even with supplemental oxygen. Muscle strength gradually declines, thinking slows, and fatigue builds with continued exposure. Climbers refer to elevations above 26,000 feet as the death zone because the body can only tolerate limited time there before deterioration begins to outweigh recovery. By 8:52 a.m., Rose had spent over 17 hours at Camp 4 post-summit. She finally began her descent. She clipped onto the fixed rope and started down the steep ice slope leading from the south col toward the upper Lhotse face. Her movements were correct. Proper clip transitions, appropriate crampon placement, controlled pace. She had listened during the guided ascent. She understood the mechanics. 2 Sherpas from a different expedition descended approximately 100 feet above her. They were guiding their own client, a Japanese climber who moved slowly but steadily. The Sherpas observed Rose but did not engage. This was not abandonment. They were assigned to their client. Stopping to assist an unaffiliated climber would delay their own descent and potentially endanger their client. The decision was procedural, not personal. At 25,600 feet, Rose made a critical decision. She reduced her oxygen flow rate from 3.0 liters per minute to 2.0 liters per minute. The reason was logical. She wanted to conserve her supply to ensure she had enough gas to reach Camp 3. What she did not account for was the physiological cost. Reducing oxygen flow at that altitude immediately decreased her blood oxygen saturation, impairing cognitive function and physical performance. The decision to conserve oxygen would cost her more time, which would cost her more oxygen. A negative feedback loop she did not recognize. At 25,300 feet, she stopped to rest at an anchor point. She remained clipped to the rope, sitting in her harness, legs dangling over the slope. She stayed there for 22 minutes. During that time, her core temperature dropped. Her muscles stiffened. Her oxygen consumption continued at 2.0 liters per minute, despite zero movement, pure waste. At that altitude, recovery windows close faster than most climbers expect. She resumed descent at 10:41 a.m. Her pace had slowed. Each step required visible effort. Her crampon placements became less precise, occasionally skittering on hard ice before biting in. She was still functional, but the margin was disappearing. At approximately 24,900 feet, still 400 vertical feet above Camp 3, Rose began showing signs of altitude-related cognitive impairment. Her clip transitions became delayed. She would reach an anchor, stare at it for several seconds, then slowly unclip her descender and re-clip beyond the anchor. On one transition, she dropped her carabiner. It tumbled down the slope, disappearing into the blue ice below. She stared after it for nearly 30 seconds before retrieving her backup carabiner from her harness. Her breathing pattern had become irregular, short, rapid gasps interspersed with longer pauses. This pattern indicated inadequate ventilation and possible early-stage high-altitude pulmonary edema, though no definitive diagnosis could be made without medical examination. Her oxygen flow remained at 2.0 liters per minute. She did not increase it. Either she did not recognize her deteriorating condition, or she remained fixated on conserving supply. At 2:11 p.m., she was observed by 2 descending climbers from a commercial expedition. They asked if she was okay. Her response was delayed, approximately 4 seconds between their question and her answer, saying she's fine and just resting. Her speech was slow, words slightly slurred. The climbers exchanged glances. One asked if she needed assistance. She waved them off. They continued descending. This moment is often cited as evidence of callousness, but the reality is more complex. The 2 climbers were clients, not guides. They had no medical training, no rescue equipment, and no authority to make decisions about another climber's care. Their own oxygen supplies were limited. Their own energy reserves were depleted. Stopping to assist Rose would have required them to remain at 24,900 feet for an indefinite period, potentially endangering themselves. They made the calculation that many climbers make in the death zone. They could not help without creating additional casualties. They reported her condition via radio to their base camp at 2:34 p.m. Base camp attempted to contact elite Himalayan expeditions to relay the information. Communication was delayed due to radio traffic and atmospheric interference. By the time the message reached elite Himalayans base camp, it was 3:18 p.m. They immediately radioed Camp 3, instructing any available Sherpas to ascend and check on Rose's condition. No Sherpas were available. All personnel were committed to ongoing descents or load carries. What happens next is quiet and irreversible. This is where the margin finally disappears, and no one reaches her in time. If you want more real breakdowns of how small decisions unravel at altitude, Consider subscribing. At 3:04 p.m., Rose reached an anchor station approximately 200 feet above Camp 3. The anchor consisted of 2 ice screws, equalized into the fixed rope with locking carabiners. She clipped in, lowered herself into her harness, and sat facing downhill with her legs extended along the slope and her back resting against the ice. Witnesses later confirmed that after sitting down, she made no further attempt to stand or continue descending. Her oxygen cylinder was still delivering flow. Based on regulator position and later equipment inspection, she had an estimated 50 minutes of supply remaining at 2.0 liters per minute. Camp 3 was clearly visible below, a line of yellow and orange tents fixed onto a carved ice platform. The vertical distance between her position and the camp was roughly 200 feet, a descent that normally required 10 to 15 minutes under controlled movement. She did not descend those final 200 feet. The system had one last chance to correct itself. It didn't. At 3:47 p.m., Dorshi Sherpa, ascending from Camp 3, carrying a load of rope and fuel, reached the anchor above her position. In his written statement, he reported seeing her seated and clipped correctly to the rope. He called out to her twice and received no verbal response. He then stepped down to her level and tapped her left shoulder. He stated that her body shifted slightly with the contact, but that she did not speak, lift her head, or adjust her position. He observed that her breathing appeared shallow and irregular. Dorchi immediately radioed Camp 3, reporting that a female climber was unresponsive at the anchor above camp and that assistance was required. 2 additional Sherpas from Camp 3 began ascending within minutes. When they reached her at approximately 4:05 p.m., they confirmed that she remained clipped securely to the anchor, her regulators still attached, her eyes partially open but unfocused. One Sherpa attempted to rouse her by adjusting her mask and speaking directly into her ear. There was no coherent response. Camp 3 coordinator radioed base camp. Base camp contacted elite Himalayan expeditions. A rescue assessment was conducted via radio conference. The conclusion was immediate. Helicopter evacuation was not considered viable under the conditions. Ground-based rescue would require multiple Sherpas ascending from Camp 3, physically moving an unresponsive climber down 200 vertical feet of steep ice, then descending further to Camp 2, where helicopter evacuation might be possible depending on weather and weight limits. The risk assessment was clear. Attempting to move an unresponsive climber at that altitude endangered the rescuers. Rose was still clipped to the anchor. She was not in immediate danger of falling. The decision was made to monitor her condition and reassess at first light. At 4:12 p.m., she was observed slumped forward in her harness, with her head down and arms hanging. By late afternoon, the margin was no longer measurable. At 4:47 p.m., her oxygen cylinder emptied, the regulator venting the last of the gas before falling silent. She remained clipped to the anchor and did not fall. Witnesses later reported that her breathing became progressively weaker before stopping. Her body was discovered at 6:33 a.m. on May 25th. By a Sherpa load carry team ascending from Camp 3. She was still secured to the fixed anchor with her harness intact and no visible traumatic injury. The oxygen cylinder was empty and the regulator remained attached to her mask. The official time of death was estimated between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. on May 24th based on environmental modeling and last confirmed observations. The cause of death was determined to be hypoxia compounded by exhaustion and hypothermia, following a delayed descent beyond her safe oxygen margin. There was no anchor failure, fall, avalanche, or storm involvement. Her body was lowered to Camp 3, transported to Camp 2 over the next 2 days, and flown to Kathmandu on May 28th once helicopter access was possible. The Nepal Department of Tourism conducted a formal investigation that reviewed radio logs, satellite phone records, witness statements, and equipment findings. The report, released June 14th, 2017, found no equipment defect, confirmed the fixed rope system was intact, and determined weather conditions were within normal summit parameters. It concluded that the guide's withdrawal was executed under signed contract terms, and that the client had sufficient oxygen for a timely descent if flow rates had been maintained and movement had remained continuous. The cause of death was attributed to prolonged exposure in the death zone, without supervised pacing, oxygen monitoring, or timely descent. The report stated that the client had been advised to descend and delayed. No negligence was found on the part of elite Himalayan expeditions or Pemba Sherpa. The investigation noted that 6 expedition companies were contacted for a replacement escort and all declined. The report did not analyze the reasons for those refusals, as Sherpa guides operate as independent contractors and are not obligated to accept clients outside their assignments. Radio records and witness statements documented prior conflicts and behavioral incidents, but these were not part of the formal findings. More than 100 Sherpas were working the South Col route on May 23rd and 24th. None were assigned to her after the withdrawal, and none accompanied her descent. Thank you for watching. For most videos like this, click here.